Frank Dawson had never considered himself a particularly observant man, but there was something about the sky that night that felt off. He stood outside his small ranch-style house on the edge of the Missouri plains, staring up at the inky blackness above. The stars seemed normal enough, scattered in their usual constellations, but one object stood out, slightly too bright, too steady. It had been hovering in the same spot for over an hour, a pale, flickering dot far too high to be any aircraft or satellite he'd ever seen. He squinted, trying to make sense of the anomaly. It was almost as if the light was shifting. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough for Frank to wonder if his eyes were playing tricks on him. Maybe it was just a new star, a comet, or some kind of celestial event he hadn't heard about. But the thing that unsettled him was how still it seemed, how unmoving, despite the wind picking up and the clouds drifting lazily by. Something gnawed at the back of his mind. Frank had always been a man of science, a high school physics teacher who explained the laws of motion with chalk and diagrams. But this was not in any textbook. He fished his phone out of his pocket and snapped a few pictures. No one would believe him otherwise. He almost went inside, dismissing the odd feeling as paranoia, but something kept him rooted to the spot. The object was still there, and now it seemed brighter, its flickering increasing in frequency, like a malfunctioning beacon. He pulled up a star mapping app on his phone, swiping through the database of constellations and satellites, but nothing matched. Frank's curiosity grew into a prickling sensation of unease. He took a deep breath and opened his browser to check the latest news, searching for anything unusual in the sky. As he scrolled through articles about weather patterns and natural disasters, a headline caught his eye. NASA announces new space mission. Unusual stellar activity detected. The story was buried under dozens of sensationalized stories about celebrities. But there it was. A single paragraph buried in the report mentioned strange fluctuations in the sky's electromagnetic signature, coming from an unidentified object in Earth's orbit. Frank's heart skipped a beat. The object above him wasn't a glitch in his vision. It wasn't a satellite or a comet. It was something new. His fingers shook as he tapped the screen to take another picture. As the camera focused, a brief, unsettling pulse of light flared from the object, a pulse that seemed to stretch, elongating across the sky. It was not a reflection. It was something alive. He sent the pictures to a friend at NASA, his old college roommate, Greg Matthews. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a weather balloon or a satellite malfunction. But something told Frank this was the start of something much bigger. And deep down, he had the sinking feeling that Earth wasn't ready for it. This continuation builds tension and sets the stage for the alien presence while keeping Frank's discovery grounded in realism. His instinctive curiosity and skepticism pull the reader in, giving them a sense of foreboding while still leaving room for the mystery to unfold. The morning after Frank Dawson sent the pictures to Greg Matthews, his inbox was flooded with responses, but none of them were from his old friend at NASA. The first email was from his cousin in Kansas City, with a link to a news story titled, "Strange Object Spotted in Missouri Sky. Is it a UFO?" The article was a local curiosity piece, dismissing the event as nothing more than a weather balloon or space debris. But Frank wasn't convinced. The images he captured didn't match anything he'd ever seen before. No known satellites, no meteorological equipment, no natural phenomenon. Just a steady, unnatural glow in the sky. By midday, Frank started hearing murmurs online. A few amateur astronomers had noticed the same thing in other parts of the country, though most shrugged it off as an anomaly. But then something changed. A Twitter account dedicated to space exploration, at Astrowatchers, posted a cryptic message. "We're tracking something unusual. It's not a satellite. It's not a comet. More to come." The cryptic post quickly gained traction, sparking conspiracy theories and whispers of government cover-ups. Frank felt his pulse quicken. He knew that this was bigger than just a curious light in the sky. He needed to act fast. His phone buzzed. Greg Matthews' name flashed on the screen. Frank. Greg's voice came through the line, sounding unusually tense. I've been looking into this thing, and you're right. It's not a glitch. NASA has just confirmed it's an unidentified object in Earth's orbit. They don't know what it is, but it's not ours. Frank swallowed hard. What do you mean, not ours? Greg hesitated. I'm not supposed to say anything, but they've been tracking it for days. It's not just in orbit. It's doing something. Moving in ways satellites don't. Changing position. He paused, his voice lower now. Look, Frank, they've started locking down information. They're not sharing anything with the public. But I know a guy who. Who what? Who might be able to give us something? Meet me at the observatory tonight. I'll bring the data. This is bigger than we thought. Frank didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, his mind racing. A strange object in the sky, something not of Earth, was now confirmed. NASA, the government, everyone was scrambling to get a handle on it. But Frank knew one thing for certain. Whatever it wasn't a random event. And if they didn't figure it out soon, it might be too late. As he drove through the familiar rural landscape toward the observatory, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from the news. Space Agency announces unexpected meteor shower. Scientists warn of possible interference from unidentified object in Earth's orbit. His stomach sank. The pieces were falling into place, and they didn't look good. This continuation ratchets up the tension, bringing in new developments while moving the story forward. Greg's phone call adds urgency, hinting at a larger, more coordinated effort to suppress information about the alien object. The stakes feel higher now, setting up the next phase of the story where Frank, along with Greg, will uncover more dangerous truths. Frank arrived at the observatory just as night fell, the crisp air biting at his skin. The facility, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of town, looked serene under the blanket of stars. But something in the air tonight felt different, like the very atmosphere was charged with anticipation. He parked quickly, barely waiting for the engine to turn off before jumping out and heading to the entrance. Inside, Greg was already waiting, his face tense and drawn. He motioned for Frank to follow him down a narrow hallway to the control room. A cluster of monitors lined the walls, some showing static, others flashing incomprehensible data. The hum of machinery was constant, but tonight there was an edge of urgency that Frank hadn't heard before. Are they still keeping it a secret? Frank asked, his voice low. Greg didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tapped a few commands into the terminal, bringing up a live feed of the object in Earth's orbit. It was larger now, unmistakable, an enormous shape, almost too perfect to be natural, moving with a precision that no known satellite or space debris could achieve. We've been tracking it for days, Greg said, his voice tight. It's not just observing. It's interacting. We've lost signal with several satellites over the past 24 hours. Communication breakdowns, power fluctuations in satellite relays, all of them centered around this thing. Frank stared at the monitor, his throat dry. The object had grown larger with each passing hour, but the real horror was the unnatural way it moved. It wasn't just orbiting the Earth, it was actively changing its trajectory, as though it was positioning itself, preparing for something. Then the lights in the control room flickered. A warning siren echoed through the building, and the monitors flashed red. What's happening? Frank's voice was rising, a knot forming in his stomach. Another signal disruption. This time, it's global. Something's happening. Greg's hands flew over the keyboard as he tried to make sense of the data. Before Frank could respond, the sky outside lit up. A brilliant flash, brighter than any lightning, pierced the darkness. Frank rushed to the nearest window, squinting at the sky. It wasn't just one flash. It was dozens, bright, jagged arcs of light shooting down from the sky, followed by a low, deep hum that seemed to resonate through the ground beneath them. Frank's heart raced. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It wasn't a meteor shower. This wasn't a natural event. The flashes weren't falling. They were rising. "We've been hit," Greg said, his voice trembling. "This is it. The strike has begun." Frank's blood ran cold. He didn't need Greg to explain. He understood now. The object was no longer just in orbit. It had unleashed its attack. The beginning of the invasion had begun. This continuation keeps the tension high with the sudden onset of the alien attack. Frank's discovery of the object's true purpose is unsettling, and the mysterious flash signals the start of something much more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. It sets the stage for a full-blown conflict, raising the stakes and pushing the story toward the inevitable confrontation. The sky continued to pulse with unnatural flashes of light, each strike deeper and more intense than the last. Frank stood frozen by the observatory window, watching in disbelief as the air above them crackled with energy. He turned to Greg, whose face was now pale, the glow from the monitor casting sharp shadows on his features. "We need to get this information out now," Frank said, his voice firm. The hum in the air was still ringing in his ears, and he could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. Greg nodded, already dialing into a secure line. "I've been trying to get through to the agency all night," he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. "But I don't think they have any idea how to stop this. The object, whatever it is, has hacked into the global comms network. No one's even broadcasting any warnings. We're on our own here." Frank's stomach churned. The thought of facing something this advanced, and alone, was overwhelming, but they didn't have time to dwell on that. They had to figure out how to respond. "We need to find a way to stop this before it spreads," Frank said. "What can we do?" Greg paused, then turned toward the wall of monitors. "I've been scanning for a pattern," he said, tapping rapidly on the keyboard. "The flashes, they're not random. They're aimed at specific regions, the interference with the satellites. It's not just jamming communication, it's taking down infrastructure, power grids, weather systems, even military communications are getting hit. Can you find where the strikes are coming from?" Frank asked, his mind racing. Greg nodded, pulling up a map of Earth's orbit. "If I can get a clearer image of that object, I might be able to pinpoint its energy emissions. But I need help. We need more data points." Without thinking, Frank grabbed his phone and made a call to his old colleague, Tessa Marshall. She was an aerospace engineer, brilliant and inventive, and she might know something the rest of them didn't. Within minutes, Frank had her on the line. "Tessa, listen to me," Frank said, urgency in his voice. "We've got a serious situation. There's an object in Earth's orbit, and it's not just sitting there. It's actively targeting us, disabling satellites, knocking out communications. We need help. We need a way to fight back." Tessa didn't hesitate. "I'll grab everything I can from the lab. Meet me at the launch site in 2 hours. I'll bring my team, and we'll figure something out." As Frank ended the call, Greg was already working on the data feeds. "I'm seeing something. The object is generating energy signatures like nothing we've ever tracked before. It's almost like..." He stopped himself, his fingers pausing midair. "It's using Earth's own electromagnetic field as a weapon." Frank's heart dropped. "We need to shut it down, or we'll be left with nothing." Greg met his eyes, grim determination settling over his face. "We will. We just need to figure out how." And for the first time since the flashes started, Frank felt a flicker of hope. They might not have the technology or the firepower to face this enemy head-on, but they had something more valuable: the ability to think, adapt, and innovate. And that, he believed, might just be enough. This continuation delves into the growing urgency of the situation, while also highlighting human ingenuity. Greg and Frank's conversation about using Earth's own electromagnetic field as a weapon builds a sense of scientific curiosity and resourcefulness, while Tessa's involvement hints at further breakthroughs that might help turn the tide. The sense of rising tension is tempered with a glimmer of hope, signaling that humanity's strength may lie in adaptability. By the time Frank and Greg met Tessa at the launch site, it felt like the world was slowly falling apart. The flashes in the sky had intensified, and the disruption in communications had spread beyond military channels. News outlets had gone dark, and global leaders were scrambling to issue warnings, though the full extent of the crisis still hadn't been fully acknowledged. Tessa was waiting by a series of large satellite dishes, her team of engineers busy setting up their equipment. She was a woman of few words, but her eyes betrayed her concern. The sharp lines of her face were etched with exhaustion, but beneath it there was a quiet determination. "You made it," she said simply, nodding at Greg and Frank. "We don't have a lot of time." Greg, who had been jittery since they'd left the observatory, wasted no time. "What can we do to get a closer look at the object?" "We need a precise angle. We think it's using Earth's electromagnetic field as a conduit for its energy weapons. If we can interrupt that connection, maybe we can disable its attack." Tessa's brow furrowed as she processed the information. She turned to her team, giving them orders in rapid-fire precision. "Set up the signal amplifier. If we can boost the satellite array's bandwidth, we might be able to get a clearer read. I need every point we can get on the object's emissions." While Tessa worked, Frank felt the weight of the situation settle around him. He glanced at Greg, who was hunched over a monitor, his hands flying over the keyboard. The air was thick with tension, and Frank's mind raced with questions. How could something so advanced have come so close to Earth without anyone knowing? How was humanity supposed to stop something that could bend the laws of physics to its will? As Tessa's team calibrated their equipment, Frank turned his attention back to the data feeds. The object, whatever it was no longer just passive. It was actively targeting energy sources, focusing on key regions across the globe. They had confirmed it was draining power from satellites, but now the larger, more dangerous pattern was clear. The alien vessel was beginning to target military installations. "The weapon isn't just disabling us," Greg muttered, his voice tight with disbelief. "It's mapping us. It's targeting our infrastructure, our military comms, nuclear sites, air defense systems." He looked up at Frank, his face pale. "It's preparing for something bigger." Frank's heart sank. "Bigger? What do you mean?" Greg met his eyes, his expression grim. "If this is what I think it is, they're setting up a global blackout, a complete shutdown. Once everything's down, we'll be sitting ducks. That's when they'll strike." Tessa stepped in, cutting through the mounting panic. "We don't have much time. We've been working on a prototype, something that could disrupt the object's power source. If we can get a signal through, just one, we might be able to turn the tide." Frank nodded. "So, what's the plan?" Tessa held up a sleek device the size of a small briefcase. "This is a phased energy disruptor. If we can get close enough to the object, we'll overload its power grid and short-circuit its ability to harness Earth's electromagnetic field. But it's risky. We'll need to be within a few miles of its position to hit a clear shot." Frank felt the weight of her words. A few miles, against an unknown alien force that could manipulate energy like a living thing. It felt impossible. But Frank had seen what humanity was capable of in the last 48 hours. Maybe it was crazy, but they had no choice but to try. "Then we do it," Frank said, his voice steady. "We fight back." This continuation builds the tension further as the team unravels the alien threat's capabilities, revealing that the object's assault on Earth is more strategic than anyone anticipated. Tessa's prototype disruptor offers a potential solution, but the risks are immense, leaving the team with no easy choices. The human will to fight back is solidified here, signaling the beginning of a high-stakes mission. The next few hours were a blur of frantic preparations. The team worked at a pace fueled by desperation, but also by a growing sense of unity. Tessa's prototype disruptor, a device designed to emit a focused electromagnetic pulse strong enough to scramble the alien's field, was their best, and perhaps only, chance. It was risky. No one could predict the exact consequences of such an attack. If they were too close, they might be obliterated by the alien vessel's retaliatory strike. If they were too far, the disruptor might not even reach the target. But Frank couldn't afford to think about failure. The world was on the brink, and there was only one way forward. "I've got a flight plan ready," Greg said, his eyes flicking over the data one last time. "We'll be close enough for the disruptor to reach the object's power core, but not close enough to get caught in the crossfire. Assuming everything goes according to plan." He shot a quick, strained smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Tessa stepped up to the table, adjusting the final settings on the disruptor. Her fingers were steady, but the tension in the air was palpable. "If this doesn't work, it's over," she said flatly. "We've got one shot at this. The object's going to be above us in less than 30 minutes, and once it reaches optimal altitude, it'll be able to launch a full-scale strike on the planet." Frank nodded, his jaw tight. He turned to Major Ryan Blake, the tough-as-nails military officer who had been assigned to lead their operation. Blake had been coordinating air support for the last 2 days, rallying what was left of the global forces in response to the alien strike. "You ready?" Frank asked. Blake's eyes were sharp, his voice calm despite the storm of chaos around them. "We're ready. We've got a fleet of jet fighters prepped to provide cover. They'll be on standby for extraction once you've planted the disruptor. If we're lucky, we'll buy you enough time to get clear." "Lucky," Frank muttered. "I'll take that. Let's get this over with." The flight to the launch site was a nerve-wracking blur. Tessa and Greg sat side by side, the disruptor secured in the cargo hold, while Blake and Frank kept their eyes on the sky. The alien vessel had moved into position, hovering just above the upper atmosphere, its massive form casting an eerie shadow across the horizon. The flashes of light continued, this time more erratic, like the ship was preparing for something much more destructive. Once they reached the target zone, Blake initiated the descent. The air seemed to grow heavy, like the weight of the world itself was pressing down on them. Tessa and Frank suited up quickly. "We'll only have a few minutes before they detect us," Tessa said. "Once we're in position, I'll activate the disruptor. If we're not out by then." "We'll be out," Frank interrupted. His mind was focused, his body humming with adrenaline. He wasn't going to let fear stop him now. As the ground approached, the ominous shape of the alien vessel loomed closer in the distance, its lights flickering like the eyes of some great predatory beast. Time was running out. Blake's voice came over the comms. 5 minutes to deployment. "Stay sharp, people." Frank took a deep breath, steadying himself. The final push had begun. This continuation builds on the mounting tension, establishing the high stakes and risks involved in the mission. Frank's team is now on the edge, preparing for a dangerous operation that will determine the fate of humanity. The looming alien vessel and the countdown to deployment create a sense of urgency, ensuring that the readers remain on the edge of their seats as the narrative nears its climax. The aircraft dropped through the clouds like a stone, the roar of its engines deafening inside the cockpit. Frank gripped the seat, his knuckles white. Below, the alien ship loomed, an enormous, jagged mass of steel and energy, hovering silently over Earth's stratosphere like a silent predator circling its prey. The flashes of light now pulsed erratically, like an unstable heartbeat, as if the ship was preparing for its next move. Tessa sat beside him, her face drawn but determined. She held the disruptor in her lap, her fingers grazing over the device as she double-checked its settings. "We've only got one shot at this," she said, her voice tight with focus. "Once we hit that power core, there's no telling what kind of backlash we'll get. The pulse could be too much for their systems to handle, or it could just make them more aggressive." Frank nodded, though his throat felt dry. The stakes couldn't have been clearer. The alien vessel had already demonstrated its ability to disable satellites, knock out power grids, and disrupt military communications. If they failed here, the world would fall into darkness, and humanity would be left vulnerable to whatever the aliens had in store. "Keep your eyes on the prize," Major Blake's voice crackled over the comms. We'll be in position for extraction in 2 minutes. Once the disruptor's active, we'll make our move. Don't get cute out there." Frank offered a strained smile. "No promises," he muttered under his breath. He could already feel the weight of what they were about to do settling over him. They were going to fight back, but this wasn't a fight they could win with weapons alone. It had to be done with brains and nerve. The aircraft leveled out, and Blake's voice came again, this time with a bit more urgency. "We've got incoming. A few drones coming off the ship's hull. They've spotted us." Frank's heart raced. Drones. The alien ship wasn't just hovering. It had defenses, and they were already moving to intercept. "Deploying countermeasures," Blake said, his voice steady. "Stay sharp." The sky seemed to crack with sudden energy. Flashing lights erupted from the alien ship, streaking toward them like streaks of fire. Blake expertly maneuvered the aircraft, evading the initial blast, but the shockwave from the near miss rattled Frank's teeth. "Hold on," Blake shouted as he banked hard, diving beneath the alien ship's shadow. Frank's mind raced. "Tessa, we need to deploy now, before they start firing again." Tessa didn't hesitate. She grabbed the disruptor, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "I need to get closer to that power core. We'll have only a few seconds before they lock onto us again." The aircraft shuddered as Blake maneuvered them into position, tipping lower and closer to the massive hull of the alien vessel. Frank could see the strange patterns and lights flickering across its surface, like a living organism reacting to their presence. Tessa activated the device, and Frank's stomach dropped as a pulse of electromagnetic energy surged through the air, a brilliant blue beam shooting from the disruptor. It struck the alien ship's power core. For a moment, everything went still. Then, the ship's lights flickered, and a violent tremor shook the entire craft. The pulse had connected. "Get out of there, now!" Blake yelled as the ship began to destabilize, the sky lighting up with energy flares. The clock was ticking. The countdown to humanity's last chance had begun. This section builds the tension to a breaking point. The close encounter with the alien drones and the deployment of the disruptor heighten the sense of danger. The moment of truth is upon them, as the team initiates their risky plan. The action is fast-paced, and the stakes are higher than ever as the alien ship begins to show signs of instability. Frank and Tessa's courage to act, despite the risk, solidifies their role in humanity's last stand. The moment the disruptor's pulse connected with the alien vessel, a strange, almost deafening silence descended. The once steady, pulsing lights on the ship flickered violently, stuttering like a dying signal, and then everything seemed to stop. The sky above them seemed to hold its breath, and for a heartbeat, Frank thought they had done it. They'd won. But that fleeting sense of victory shattered when the alien ship groaned, a low, ominous sound that reverberated through the air. The hull rippled, as if the vessel itself were trying to shake off the attack. Then, with terrifying speed, a massive shockwave erupted from its center, expanding outward in a blinding flash of light. Frank's world tilted, and the aircraft was thrown violently off course. Alarms blared in his earpiece. The pulse had triggered a backlash. The alien vessel had retaliated. The shockwave hit the atmosphere, destabilizing the air around them. Blake fought the controls, trying to regain control of their descent, but the turbulence was intense. "Brace. Hold on," Blake shouted over the din. The aircraft dipped, spiraling as the force of the blast rattled their senses. Frank's vision blurred for a moment, and he gritted his teeth, fighting the nausea. They were too close, the ship too powerful, the pulse too much. He glanced at Tessa, her face set in grim determination, but she was gripping the disruptor, her eyes darting between the device and the chaotic screens around them. "Are we clear?" Frank managed to shout, his voice barely audible over the thrumming turbulence. I think so," Tessa yelled back, her fingers moving quickly over the controls. "We've hit it, but there's more coming. It's reacting, and it's not good." Blake fought to stabilize the aircraft, but the ship was beginning to come apart under the pressure. They had triggered something, but now they were in the eye of the storm. Frank could feel it. The alien ship was on the brink of collapse, but the explosion had sent ripples of energy far beyond their reach, disrupting everything in its path. Tessa's voice cracked through the static. "We need to get out. Now." Blake's eyes were wild as he glanced at the redouts. "I can't hold her together much longer." They were losing altitude. Frank's mind raced. They had hit the power core, but it wasn't enough. The ship was going to retaliate in full force. He turned to Blake, his voice urgent. "We need to get above it. We need to get clear of the blast zone before it blows." But as Blake banked hard to climb, the shockwave hit again. This time, there was no avoiding it. A sudden, earth-shattering explosion erupted from the alien ship. The force of it felt like a punch to the chest. Everything around them was bathed in a brilliant white light. And for a moment, Frank thought he had died. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the world fell silent again. The shockwaves dissipated. The aircraft was still aloft, miraculously intact, though battered. Frank looked out of the window, his breath catching in his throat. The alien vessel was gone. The sky above them was eerily quiet. The streaks of light that had marked its presence now faded into nothing. The ship had exploded, obliterated by the very energy it had used to attack Earth. Frank's heart pounded, but he could hardly believe it. They had done it. Against all odds, they had stopped the invasion. Tessa let out a breath, her shoulders slumping with relief. "We did it," she whispered. Blake looked over at them, his face pale but resolute. "Not yet. We've still got a lot of rebuilding to do. But for now, humanity had one thing it hadn't had for a long time: a future." And as Frank watched the debris of the alien ship scatter across the horizon, he knew that whatever came next, humanity had just proven something to itself, that it was no longer a passive player in the universe. Earth had fought back. This final part brings the story to a high-stakes conclusion. The alien vessel's destruction is a major victory, but the aftermath leaves humanity with much to rebuild. The focus on the team's perseverance and the final blow to the alien force underscores the theme of human resilience and ingenuity. The story ends with both relief and the promise of challenges ahead, setting the stage for potential new conflicts or a new chapter in humanity's place in the universe.